And one way to raise more revenues, to raise taxes, the payroll tax right now is 12.4%. That's up from, I think, 6% in 1960 and 10%, around 10% in 1978. It's half paid by the worker, half by the employer. Raised to 13.4%, 14%, something like that. But there's a downside to raising taxes. Could you talk a little bit about that?
Sure. So, I think it was Thomas Sowell who said, there are no solutions, there are just trade-offs, right? So every time you raise a tax, that cuts everyone's take-home pay. I mentioned this earlier, that's basically going to eat into people's savings. That's just going to make daily life generally just harder for people. So I think kind of there's a risk there that when you start, increasing the cost of living, that makes it, harder for people to save, for retirement. That makes it harder for people to put it into their 401ks, into their Roth IRAs, which, I hate to admit it, probably have a better rate of return than a Social Security check anyway. So I mean, the other concern I would have is if you start increasing sort of Social Security, if you start trying to increase the payout for Social Security through raising taxes, that may sort of lull people into a false sense of security that, okay, the tax rate's gone up, ergo I'm going to get more money when I retire. Ultimately, it's $1 trillion deficit. That's probably not going to happen because the job of, first and foremost, the federal government's got to do is just fund that liability. You're probably not going to get any more money out of it if the first job is to fund that liability. So I don't necessarily think just like, raising taxes is going to be the optimal public policy solution. I will just to kind of piggyback on something Elisa said, because I think she's absolutely right that privatizing Social Security is not popular among the American people. But I would also add that like Social Security is not popular either. I think it was an AARP study came out not too long ago that said, about 30% of the American people have confidence in Social Security. I don't think it has to be a binary choice between a fully public system, the pay-as-you-go system, versus a fully private system. I think there's potentially some, middle ground here that, we don't have to have this system that clearly very few Americans trust, or we don't have to have this potentially fully private system that I agree with you, I don't think many Americans would have confidence in, although I would argue that the rate of returns would likely be higher.
So what we actually saw in the surveys, and thank you for bringing that up, this is a survey that AARP does every 5 years on Social Security. We call it our anniversary survey, so this one was the 90th anniversary survey. And what we see actually in that is, as you were saying, very low confidence in the future of Social Security. About 36% of people said they were confident in its future. But what we also see in survey after survey is really high support for the program. So that dichotomy of high support for Social Security at the same time of low confidence in its future, that has been the case for decades in survey after survey. So I think what that goes to show is that people do not have much confidence because they hear all of these news stories that say things like Social Security is going broke, which, as we've talked about, is not really an accurate way to describe it. But people definitely say that they value Social Security. 96% in this most recent survey said that they think it's one of the most important programs, including 96% said they think it's very important, including 74% who said they think it's one of the most important programs that we have.